Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to another Myth Salon. Well, today marks another milestone in the pandemic crisis that we're facing in our country. We're way past 6 million cases in the United States. We have 190,000 deaths, and there just does not seem to be an end in sight. And so what I would like to do is open the Myth Salon with a moment of silence, and then we'll get going. Thank you, everyone, for attending and for taking time out of your schedules to join us in the Myth Salon. I'd like to read just a couple little things from Chuang-Tzu. Those who know they are fools are not the biggest fools. So here's a poem called The Fool. Get out of the way, self. There are places to go, things to do. But churning inside me, fears of appearing foolish rush over me like a tsunami. Each task forming a cage around my soul, narrowing my identity to my desires. When I was drenched, all that remained was the fool I had become, unable to keep myself dry any longer. My tasks lay beneath the ocean inside me. Empty shells on the sandy bottom, no longer filled with purpose. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to my very good friend, Will Lin, without whom the Myth Salon just would have never been born into a reality. And he will introduce our featured panelists today, our guest speaker, Dr. Roger Walsh. And let's see if we can make some wisdom today. Will?
Thank you, Dana. And of course, I got to respond to your point about making the Myth Salon possible. The coolest thing about the Myth Salon has always been that it feels like it is co-created by everyone who participates. I feel like I'm doing a tiny little piece, and then it all adds up and it comes out to be this incredible community. So thank you for the acknowledgement, even if it's more than it feels like it takes. You know, this comes together as a self-organizing, self-creating community, which is the coolest thing about it. So it is my honor to introduce the panel and to introduce our guest, Dr. Roger Walsh. So you know Dana White, scholar, author, and host of this Myth Salon, and an adjunct faculty member at Pacifica Graduate Institute. My name is Will Lin. I lightly moderate these Myth Salons. My PhD is in myth. I've spent years working for the Joseph Campbell Foundation and building an academic department for filmmakers and performing artists at what's now called Hushan College. We're also joined by Selena Matthews, who's a clinical psychologist, author, and keynote speaker, who graduated from Pacifica and has been an ever-present participant and supporter of this Myth Salon. Zaman Stanizai is professor of mythology and political science at Pacifica and Cal State, a poet, a linguist, a mystic, and a Fulbright scholar. Boris Nunley is a professor of rhetoric and philosophy at UC Riverside and the author of Keeping It Hush, The Barbershop and African-American Hush Harbor Rhetoric. And I'd also like to welcome Connie Zweig, who we should thank for introducing us to Roger. Connie is an internationally renowned psychologist for her work on shadow, whose books include Meeting the Shadow and Romancing the Shadow. And we have a special guest on our panel tonight, Dr. Taria Ward, is the founder of Bridging Worlds, a mountain retreat center, who carries a PhD in depth psychology from Pacifica, and her expertise in indigenous consciousness is especially welcome tonight. Thank you, Taria, for joining us. And tonight we're going to engage the big question of wisdom, and we couldn't be more lucky to explore the topic from the perspective of a world record high diver, and a circus acrobat, and a Lama and Tibetan Buddhist Dzogchen, you're gonna have to help me with that tradition, and an expert on both shamanism and altered states. Dr. Roger Walsh is the recipient of over 20 international awards and the author of 8 books, a professor, a physician, a therapist, a spouse, spiritual practitioner, and an inquisitive human being. I hope you all join me in welcoming Roger. Thank you. I will do my best. I'm sure we all will to receive your wisdom tonight. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Will. And of course, it's not my wisdom that we'll be talking about. Actually, my hope is we'll look at look at the human understanding of wisdom and make use of it at this particular time in our culture when we need it so desperately. We're in a very paradoxical situation. Dana mentioned the extraordinary death toll and infection rate from COVID, but of course, that's only one of the many crises we're facing. And in many ways, we're in a unique situation. Well, in many ways, we're in a unique situation. But one of the key features is that most of the threats we're facing, for the first time in human history, most of them are human caused. And technological power has become so great that the state of the world now reflects the state of our minds. And yet we have this incredible imbalance between our ever accelerating technological capacities and our not so accelerating capacity for inner development, wisdom, other virtues, love, compassion, ethics, morality, etc. So we have this incredible imbalance between our outer powers and our inner powers. And we've become something like a sorcerer's apprentice. We have enormous power and not so much wisdom. We've become nuclear giants and technological wizards while remaining ethical infants and wisdom dwarfs. This is not a good balance. In fact, it's a recipe for disaster. And so one of the great questions of our time is, can we find the resources, the tools, the ways of cultivating our inner capacities, our virtues, our skills, our strengths, our altruism, our generosity, our compassion, all these qualities that we know we have, but which the wisdom traditions suggest are really underdeveloped. And so what I hope we can explore today is the possibility that there are ways of developing these capacities, these virtues, these classic virtues, the qualities of heart and mind that have been most esteemed across human history and most sought after. And across thousands of years, quite literally, wisdom, love, compassion have been valued as some of the greatest of all human qualities and capacities. And yet something rather curious and disturbing has happened over the last 3 or 4 centuries, and that is wisdom and virtues pretty much disappeared from our cultural landscape and conversation, largely eclipsed by science and technology with their incredible accelerating capacities for working magic in the outer world. And that led to an eclipse of focus on our inner world and our inner capacities. And we live very much, as everyone knows, in a technological, materialist, focused culture and increasingly world. Yet that's the problem. Yet there's also some real possibilities, because if we look across the world's cultures, this is the first time in human history we've had access to all the world's wisdom traditions, all the world's contemplative practices, all the techniques and skills that humans have developed over thousands of years for cultivating our inner world, indigenous practices, Indian yogic practices, Confucian reflection, Jewish dyadic exploration, on and on and on. If we look across the world, we find all this reservoir of wisdom and wisdom practices just waiting to be mined. And we can combine that for the first time also with our rapidly developing knowledge and knowledge systems, science, the philosophy, psychology, depth psychology, and which is the province of this community so much. Yet this just hasn't been put together. And that's one of the great opportunities of our time, taking the wisdom, the perennial wisdom from across the world's cultures and traditions and contemplative practices, and drawing them together and beginning to integrate those with contemporary science and psychology and sociology, philosophy, etc. There are really amazing possibilities here. And so hopefully we can explore those. So wisdom awaits us. The question is, can we take this opportunity? Can we make the most of this possibility of having all these resources available and distill them into practices and understandings appropriate to our time and the challenges we face? So that's our current dilemma and opportunity, the eclipse of wisdom on one side, the eclipse of our inner world more generally, by the technological miracles all around us and the seductions and tranquilizations with trivia. And on the other hand, the availability for the first time from across the world of the world's wisdom traditions. So let's begin and see if we can put these together in some useful way. Well, of course, the first question that comes up when we begin to talk about wisdom is, well, what is it? And I think one useful way of making sense of it to begin is to talk about the history, the way in which wisdom has been understood, both in our culture and in Eastern cultures. And if we look across the centuries, what we find is the beginning in ancient Greece, there was a recognition that there are really at least two major kinds of wisdom. There was what was called sophia, which was an kind of insight and understanding of ourselves and the world and the great principles by which nature operates. And on the other hand, there was phronesis, practical wisdom, kind of how do we live skillfully and well our own lives, but also in community with others. And we find a similar theme across Asian traditions. We find, for example, in Buddhism, two kinds of wisdom, prajna and upaya. Prajna is deep insight into the fundamental nature of reality. It's a really perspicacious cutting through into a recognition of the fundamental nature of experience. Then there's upaya, which is translated as skillful means. And skillful means, particularly from the Buddhist and more generally the contemplative perspective, is the capacity for helping others to heal and mature and awaken. And those words, that word awaken, will take on greater significance as we begin to explore these contemplative traditions. But the point here for us at the moment, as we come to try and get a sense of what wisdom is that wisdom has at least these two major elements. Now, we'll want to tease that out more, but to begin with, wisdom is a both deep insight, a deep, profound seeing, and practical skill in living. So if we put that together and look across the different traditions, both contemporary research and philosophy, but also the perennial wisdom, how can we put this together? Here's a definition which has taken a lot of years actually to put together, as fine-honed in many ways. But what I want to suggest is that wisdom is deep, accurate insight and understanding and the central existential issues of life, plus skill in responding effectively and benevolently. So let's parse that out a bit because there's a lot in there. So wisdom is deep, accurate insight and understanding oneself and the central existential issues of life. You'll recognize that as the sophia, or the prajna, the deep insight side of wisdom, plus skill in responding effectively and benevolently. That's the practical side of it. That's the how then do we live side of wisdom. Okay, so let's go a little deeper. So wisdom is deep, accurate insight. and understanding of oneself and the central existential issues of life. So first, wisdom is deep insight. So it's a deep seeing into the nature of the world and ourselves. And it's understanding. And those two are actually different, because insight can be a direct intuitive seeing, or as we'll see later, it can be even for contemplatives, it can be a trans-rational seeing, a way of seeing that goes beyond the conceptualizing mind. So deep, accurate insight and understanding. Yes, the insight can be a direct intuition, but insights can be enriched by conceptual understanding, by seeing associations, by recognizing implications. So wisdom is both this intuitive insight plus conceptual understanding. Well, insight and understanding of what? Well, two things in particular: oneself and the central existential issues of life. And of course, we're all familiar with, say, the writing on some of the ancient Greek temples, know thyself. And so that is a very ancient theme, the idea that to the extent we know ourselves, there's wisdom there, that what we're unaware of in ourselves, as the Jungians point out so well, what we are unaware of usually tends to get acted out in life. And if we're unaware of our own dynamics, our own motives, our own distortions, they will play themselves out, usually in very painful ways. So deep, accurate insight and understanding of oneself and of the central existential issues of life. Well, what are they? Well, the central existential issues, or existential issues, are ones that all of us face simply by fact of existing as human beings. There, for example, if we think, for example, of suffering, which is one of the things that wisdom has to deal with, some kind of suffering is circumstantial. It depends on, how particular, whether we get hit by a truck or any number of things. But other issues are existential. They just come with having a body. Bodies age, they sicken, they die. Those are existential issues and existential kinds of suffering. And other existential issues are, for example, finding a meaning and purpose in life, dealing with both isolation and relationship, because both are challenging, dealing with trying to make sense of this unbelievable, infinite, bottomless mystery of this universe we're born into. Why and how? So these are the two things that wisdom in particular focuses on understanding oneself. And of course, we'll want to parse out later what oneself means, because there's a universe just implied there alone, and the existential issues of life, the central challenges and issues that all of us have to face. And I would want to add a little nuance here in this definition. I have deep, accurate insight and understanding. And I've come to think that it might be even more appropriate to say that wisdom is deep, nuanced insight and understanding of oneself and the central existential issues of life. That is one of the things that the wise seem to be able to do, is they bring a subtlety of perception and introspection to experience. So they're able to feel into and recognize subtle distinctions. And that, of course, everyone here has an interest in the inner world and mythology, and we know how important that is in our inner world, being able to bring a subtle discernment to our experience and self-understanding. That's the sophic or prajna or insight aspect of wisdom. Then there's the practical wisdom side, the skill in responding effectively and benevolently. So what I like about this definition, of course, I love it because it's my definition, but in addition, I like it because skill, each of these words is so potent. Skill And the way we usually think of it in Western terms is a capacity for acting very effectively. And it's a kind of expertise that's developed. And there's a whole research field now on development of expertise. And we know how to develop skills. And we find that there are common principles across enterprises or skill sets ranging from chess to music to athletics. And there are certain general principles that just go into developing a particular skill. Practice, for example, but very specific kinds of practice that focus on weaknesses in particular, and get feedback from someone more skilled than yourself immediately, and, and on. So maybe we'll get into that in more detail later. So this points out that practical wisdom is a skill. It's something we can develop and cultivate, and there are ways of doing it. And we can draw both from the ancient wisdom traditions, the philosophers, the contemplatives, and we can now draw also from contemporary research on skill development. So practical wisdom is a skill, and it's a skill in responding effectively and benevolently to the central existential issues of life. And so let's go to benevolently, because one of the key features of wisdom is that wisdom inherently aims for something beyond one's own egocentric benefit. Wisdom really aims for a greater good, a deeper good, a more encompassing benefit for everyone involved. And I would even go so far as to say the depth of one's wisdom correlates or is related to the scope of one's benevolence. If is one thinking only of oneself, that's egocentricity. That isn't wisdom. If one's thinking only of one family, a little more. But if one begins to think, say, as the Native Americans speak of 7 generations forth, and begins to look across beyond even my own ethnocentric biases and my tribe to all tribes, all people, and beyond that, all sentient beings, all life, then we're talking some of the most profound kinds of wisdom and practical wisdom. So benevolence, this is a wide embrace of concern and care and compassion. So there's the desire for practical wisdom to respond as skillfully as possible and as benevolently as possible. And one of the hallmarks of practical wisdom is not only is it well intended, not only is it benevolent, but it is effective. We look at sages, they just seem to have a sense of how to leverage their impact. So I am reminded of Archimedes and his statement, give me a place to stand and a lever long enough and I will move the world. It's like, okay, that's in contemporary terms, we'd talk about trim tabbing. The trim tab being the little airfoil at the back of the rudder of a plane. And you move that tiny little airfoil one way, the rudder moves the other way, and the whole plane swings. It's leveraging one's point of impact so as to have most effect. And that's what sages seem to be really good at. So that I would like to suggest is an understanding of what wisdom is. It's deep, nuanced insight and understanding of both oneself and the central existential issues of life that we all face simply by virtue of being born into a body. If you got a body, you got existential issues. Plus, on the practical side, wisdom is skill in responding effectively and benevolently. Okay, so that's a kind of, that's a definition we can work with and play with. And maybe you want to add something or nuance it in particular ways. Now, I introduced this definition by saying that we look over centuries, there's been this recurrent theme, this recognition that there's both there are two aspects, an insight aspect and a practical aspect. But I think as I look across the world's wisdom traditions and contemplative practices and philosophies, it seems pretty clear that that's only a beginning. We need to nuance more than that. And I would say that clearly on the insight side, there's intuitive wisdom and there's conceptual wisdom. And one can think of a distinction between, say, a conceptual wisdom, a philosopher type. I think maybe Aurobindo, the great Indian philosopher sage. Some think of him as the greatest philosopher sage in human history. Not necessarily the greatest contemplative or sage, although he was unbelievably brilliant. And some would say not the greatest philosopher, but perhaps the greatest combination. So he'd be someone on that side. But the intuitive side, one can think of a wonderful archetypal figure of wisdom as think of a grandmother in a pre-literate tribal culture who doesn't know how to read or write, but somehow everyone comes to her for advice. And that would be an example of someone with deep intuitive wisdom, just someone who feels into and can feel how to respond appropriately to people and situations. So I think we can add that. And we can also add, I don't want to complicate too much, but I just want to mention two other dimensions of wisdom. One is states of consciousness. If there's one thing the contemplative traditions have taught us, it's that the human consciousness is plastic. And of course, we've known that in the West since the advent of psychedelics. When the psychedelics hit, they just showed us that consciousness was a lot more plastic than we had ever imagined. And the effects of that are still reverberating through Western culture. And one of the ways of understanding some of the cultural turmoil in our culture is to appreciate that, 50 years ago, we were what is called a monophasic culture. That is, we were a culture which drew our understanding of life and ourselves and reality primarily from one state of the consciousness, the usual waking state. And yet most of the world's cultures are what are called multiphasic cultures. And multiphasic cultures are cultures which draw their understanding of life and oneself and reality from multiple states, from dreams, from reverie, from intuition, from contemplative practices, yoga, meditation, zikr, etc., etc. So these are multiphasic or polyphasic cultures. And what's been happening in the West, it's almost never recognized, but once you see this, it makes sense of a lot of things, is that our culture has been transitioning from a monophasic culture to a polyphasic culture. And a lot of the turmoil in the 60s was clearly around that, and subsequent turmoil too. So one added dimension for wisdom is that we have been told for millennia by contemplative practitioners that certain kinds of insights only become available in certain states of consciousness. That when one learns to concentrate and refine and hone the mind and see with extraordinary clarity and concentration and calm, one is able to penetrate into the depths of one's understanding and see how the mind works in ways that just aren't available to us with untrained minds. So wisdom is some of the most profound kinds of wisdom depend on inner training, contemplative understanding. Of course, psychotherapists understand this to an extent, but the contemplative traditions with their years of intense training of the mind take this to a whole nother level. And then another dimension we want to add is development, adult psychological development. And to my mind, of course, this is my take, but the most exciting discovery in Western psychology in the last 50 years has been the recognition that psychological maturation can continue beyond early adulthood. We used to think the mind more or less stopped growing when the body stopped growing, but that is absolutely totally wrong. And we know that, or at least it can be wrong. Yes, it is possible to stagnate at any age and at any stage. However, what has now become crystal clear from the research on adult development is that it is possible for adults to move through additional so-called post-conventional stages. We come into the world as not a tabula rasa, but we come in uncultured. We are encultured and go from pre-conventional to conventional. And with the conventional stage, we pretty much accept the cultural mythos and beliefs and values in an unquestioned way. But the great developmental stage, at least the first great developmental stage in adult beyond conventionality, is when we begin to step back and question for ourselves the premises and myths and givens of our culture. And then we begin to move to what's called a self-authoring stage. Instead of a literal mythic stage, we move to the first post-conventional stage of self-authoring. We are taking responsibility for our understanding, our worldview, our appreciation of what really makes sense, what is right to do, etc. And so maxims like "my country, right or wrong," well, was that really true? Under what circumstances? Can my country do no wrong, etc. So, and we've seen some of the cultural revolutions we have been witnessing over the last couple of decades or more now have been a reflection of the maturation of a significant minority of the population to post-conventional stages. And once you see that, a lot of things about cultural conflict begin to make sense in a whole different way that is absolutely impossible to make sense of before then. Because then you can see that a lot of our cultural conflicts, red, blue states, woke, no, etc., really, to some extent, reflect a conflict between conventional and post-conventional worldviews and values. So wisdom, it seems, develops as people mature. And that is a novel insight. That's something which we in the West and Western psychology can take real credit for, because one only recognizes adult developmental stages through researching large groups of people. Altered states you can recognize immediately yourself. If you're in an altered state, the phenomenology, the experience is very different. But developmental stages operate in the background. They're like the operating system of the mind. And they determine the way we see, but because they're the substrate and operating system, they're what we look through and we're not able to look at. So we can now add developmental psychology to our understanding of wisdom and appreciate that wisdom is capable of maturing as people mature. Okay, so that's what is wisdom. One key question is, well, if wisdom is deep insight and understanding, well, what does wisdom see and what does it recognize? And we can look at this in various ways. Well, let's play with some of the central insights of Buddhism. And Buddhism is easy to work with because the great religious scholar Houston Smith said, of all the great traditions, it is Buddhism which puts its message most psychologically. So it's relatively easy to translate into our Western culture. And I'll just add that one of the tasks which we are called to in our time is to be what is called what Carl Jung called Gnostic Intermediaries. And I love this concept of Jung's. He used it to refer to Wilhelm, the translator of the I Ching. And he said Wilhelm was a Gnostic intermediary. He imbibed that wisdom, so he was able to transmit it to our culture. And as far as I can see, becoming a Gnostic, we are all called to be Gnostic intermediaries in our multicultural world at the moment. And what it seems to take to be a Gnostic intermediary, to be able to be someone who can actually transmit wisdom across cultures and across ages, because a lot of the a lot of the understanding and wisdom of previous centuries is cast in very archaic terms and concepts and worldviews. So we need Gnostic intermediaries who can translate our own Western heritage and bring it into contemporary, say, psychological concepts and frameworks. And we need Gnostic intermediaries who can translate from other cultures, indigenous cultures, Asian cultures, and make sense of the wisdom embedded in those traditions, make sense of them for us. And as far as I can see, a Gnostic intermediary has to be able to do three things. One is to imbibe the wisdom of a tradition or a text or a culture into themselves so that it becomes their own. The second is to learn the language and concepts and conceptual system and worldview of the people they're trying to, or community they're trying to communicate to. And the third is to be able to translate in such a way as the wisdom, it's like, makes sense. It just translates in it, oh yes, of course. So it's a translation out of one's direct experience into the concepts and language of the community you're trying to translate to. So there was a little aside about one of the challenges of our time, but that is actually one wisdom task for our time. So what does wisdom see? So I mentioned Buddhism as the tradition which is most psychological in its orientation. And in Buddhism, they talk, or in the classic Buddhism, they talk of three characteristics of existence. The characteristics being that everything changes and what we take to be ourself is illusory, and that the suffering is part of life, certainly part of unenlightened life. So everything changes. And one of the beautiful things about insight such as this is seeing into reality. It's like, okay, everything changes. Well, it's like, yeah, you can say, oh yeah, okay, interesting. Yeah, everything changes. I get it. Or you can really reflect on it, and you can introspect, and you can meditate on it. And then it just gets richer and richer and richer. And go, yeah, we all know that things change. Seasons change. You know, our kids grow up. We start getting gray hair, whatever, blah, blah, blah. So that changed, but that's interesting. But then there are implications, and it's like, okay, everything changes. Nothing's really predictable. We begin to appreciate, as the Buddha said, fortune changes like the flick of a horse's tail. We can't rely on anything. There's a certain uncertainty in life and a precariousness, and carpe diem, seize the moment, because anything can change at any moment. And then there are deeper levels. There are contemplative levels of understanding, where those of you who've done, for example, Vipassana insight meditation, know that if you really look at your experience, you find that everything is in constant flux, and you can't grab any experience at all. And what we think of as our solid experience, the more we look, the more it dissolves into this flux of evanescent flux. And that has enormous implications, because it's when we solidify our experience and assume it's unchanging, that we begin, that just brings on kinds of suffering. And then there's appreciation of the brevity of life. If there's one thing sages have warned us about, it's that life, when you get towards the end of it, looks really short. And I remember my 80-year-old aunt saying once, it's such a surprise to wake up and find you're old. And yet it's not like we haven't been told. And the other implication is that death is inevitable and unpredictable. And so how do we live our lives in the face of our mortality? How do we using Carlos Castaneda's terms, how do we turn death into an advisor, placing it on our shoulder as an ever-present reminder of the preciousness and brevity of life, and never knowing when that will happen. 3 years ago, my wife and I went out to dinner, and 5 minutes after we we arrived at a friend's place. She complained of feeling dizzy and having chest pain, and 5 hours later she was dead. It's like no warning. Or on the other hand, a lifetime of warning. It's like sages have been screaming at us across the centuries that this can happen at any time. And if we reflect, if we open to this, then a neighbor came by the next day and said, "You don't seem surprised." And I said, "Well, I'm not surprised. I'm in deep shock, but I'm not surprised. I knew this would, either I'd go first or she'd go." So, but I had an interesting lesson on the power of this kind of reflection, because a few months later, a neighbor died, and I went down to comfort his wife, and the neighbor had been 87. And the wife said, "You just don't expect this." Well, at 87, actually you do. You know, there's a good chance it's going to happen. So change, the brevity of life. Wisdom appreciates the brevity of life, the uncertainty. Wisdom also understands the mind and deep insight into the way the mind works. And they've long been, contemplatives have long had a profound understanding of the way the mind works. So there's that. And one of the beautiful additions of Western psychology has been the appreciation of psychodynamics, that there are forces that operate in the mind below and beyond our awareness. And that Socrates thought, that all stupidity stemmed from ignorance. Well, now we know that's only part of the story. You can know the way things are, but you can still act very stupidly, because our minds have a mind of their own. So knowing the mind, knowing who we actually are, and that is another story we could go into, because there are depths of understanding. And one of the contemplative contributions is the recognition that what we take ourselves is actually just a self-representation. And the words give it away. We talk about our self-concept, our self-image, but we never seem to appreciate that how much is in those words, that what we mistake to be ourselves is just an image or a concept or an idea. It's not ourselves. It's just a pointer to a deeper, more profound identity that most of us only touch into if we do very deep introspection and contemplation. So one of the great wisdom recognitions is that all of us suffer from a case of mistaken identity, and that waking up to our true identity is one of the greatest things that a human being can do. Because only when we recognize who we really are do we recognize who others really are, and that we're not only more than we think, we're more than we can think. And that naturally when we recognize that, we want to honor both ourselves and others as the sacred beings we truly are. And I think I'll just make one other observation about what wisdom sees, and that is wisdom recognizes that we live in profound, bottomless mystery. That no matter how much we know, everything we learn just unearths further questions, further mystery, and that this is bottomless, radical mystery. And it's so, I spent so many years thinking there was something wrong with me because I just couldn't get it. It was always seemed like, oh, I'll get it. And finally, there was this real moment of insight. It's like, oh yeah, that's just the way it is, and the way it's always going to be. There is no end to mystery. And that's actually good news. It undoes dogmatism and and a lot of problems, and opens us to this extraordinary mystery of life. So there are other aspects of wisdom. Maybe towards the end of our program, I'd like to come back and just talk a little more about practical wisdom and its applications to the great issues of our time. But I think I've talked enough, and it'd be wonderful to hear from the panelists.
Wow, thank you. I know I'm thanking you for all of us first, but thank you. That was wonderful. incredible survey, and I have a million things to say and respond to, and I guess I'll try and pick one quickly. But actually, I'm curious. You mentioned that we live in a monophasic society, and I'm interested in the possibility that we are actually in a multiphasic society that is in a delusion that it's monophasic. That these things that we do have insights and wisdom, and our religions are built around stuff that comes from other states of consciousness and experiences and all this kind of stuff, but that we actually maybe delude ourselves into a kind of repressing or ignoring or denying that is where some of this wisdom comes from.
Very interesting observation. I hadn't thought of that. Thank you, Will. Yeah. I'd love to hear what other people think.
My sense is that there's this worship of rationality. And, the heroic ego's rationality, and that stage of development, as Roger was calling it, controls the narrative and controls the mythology and controls the institutions. And so it looks like it's monophasic, but I think one of the things that's been revealed in the Trump years is the many, many stages of development in the culture, the many operating systems that we weren't even, that some of us weren't even aware of. And that those reflect other stages of development in the American population. So, and I do know some people, few people who are in higher stages who have access to natural states and stages of development. And so, yeah, I think I'd agree with you, Will. It's a really good insight.
Oh, well, I've got to thank Jeff Kripal, to be honest with you, because what he keeps saying is he's like, look, we keep putting the spiritual experiences off the table because we, as our intellectual, academics, we want to make sense of religion with what we're willing to have on the table. And we're not willing to say, and I think it's the same thing for that heroic egoic consciousness as you're describing. That from that modality, it doesn't want to acknowledge or recognize the other. And you kind of almost recognize it as the standard beginning of the individuation or the hero's journey, where that kind of egoic, overly logical, normal, comfortable world consciousness is cracked open, and you're asked to begin integrating more of yourself.
And to let go of conceptualizing, to let go of the, like Roger just said, the myth that you're going to figure it out.
I'm trying.
And it's one of the things that my marriage gave me. I let go of the need to understand in my marriage. And it was unbelievably freeing. It was just liberating, incredibly liberating. So we have, what I'm hearing, Roger, is we have so many different sources of wisdom. We have this democratization of the perennial mystical traditions, which many of us have been exploring for decades now in our own journeys. And we have the wisdom of the unconscious from that lineage that we are steeped in. And we have a certain kind of wisdom from today's, Western technological advances. So how are you, this is a really complex subject that you've taken on, Roger.
Oh, yes.
It's really complex. And I know, because I know you, that you're using some of Ken Wilber's integral mapping to kind of make sense of all this. But I'm wondering, what is one doorway to open if you want to explore this? Because I'm seeing so many doorways. We also have this term wise elder, which is in the vernacular, which makes us associate wisdom with age rather than with stage, right? So I'm just wondering if you could guide some of us into a direction for study or contemplation or more specifically.
Yeah, okay. So you're basically asking about how do we develop it, which would be nice. uh, uh, and you're also pointing to the story, putting in question marks the quotes wise elder. And the way I understand it is that yes, wisdom can take a long time to really mature and develop and enrich itself. And there's no guarantee that that comes with age. And that's what the research is beginning to show, that actually there's not much of a correlation with age at all. And that is not all that surprising. You figure the average American spends something like 4 hours in front of a TV screen. So, which is not exactly conducive to wisdom. So most lifestyles are not wisdom conducive. And that's a sad fact of our culture. And it's even, and perhaps in some ways, it's even more so in contemporary times than it has been in the past, because we have now in Western culture mastered the art of tranquilization by the trivial. And our technological toys and trinkets give us an endless stream of trivia with which we can distract ourselves from the great issues of life. And we do it very well. In fact, there are billions of dollars spent on research and people figuring out how to keep us entranced and trivialized. So we really need to acknowledge that we're up against not only the limitations of our own minds, which as psychotherapists, psychologists, people who are interested in myth, you understand well, we are now up against also against a major industries that want to keep us pretty much half asleep and half awake. So for the cultivation of wisdom, maybe we'd be good to step back and say, Connie, you pointed to the fact that there seem to be multiple the culture wars reflect conflict between multiple stages. And that's actually true. If you map out the developmental stages, there's Western culture, particularly American culture at this time, has people at 3 major stages. One is a pre-conventional, literally what's technically called the mythic literal stage, where which is kind of, let's call it fundamentalist would be one example. And then there's the conventional stage, which is more the rational, scientific, hero, ego, as you said, Connie. And then there are post-conventional stages, which are the stages where people begin to reflect and question, and that's more the postmodern. Each of these stages has its strengths and its traps, and we don't want to just say that, everyone should get out of earlier stage and mature into the latter, because all these stages have their strengths and their traps, but there is this conflict. So for cultivating wisdom, which is the essence of your question, that could be a talk. I mean, that could be another evening, and it'd be a very valuable one, but let me try and keep it simple. Let me just mention 3 practices which are really key for developing wisdom and for developing other virtues. Let me mention first off, I spent 3 years writing a book called Essential Spirituality, the 7 Central Practices. And what I was really interested in was, what have the greatest minds and saints and sages of human history had to say about what are the qualities that are really worth devoting one's life to developing, and how do you do it? And so I looked across the world's traditions, particularly the religions, and what surprised me most in those 3 years was that every single tradition said that for every single virtue, if you want to develop this, hang out with people who have it. Consciousness is catchy. If you want to develop wisdom or ethics or love or compassion or generosity, hang out with people who have these qualities. And this is borne out by contemporary research on so-called social contagion. It's like the data is crystal clear. If your friend's cousin, who you haven't even met, puts on 20 pounds, you're likely to put on a couple of pounds yourself. behaviors and states of mind get transmitted across social networks far more extensively and subtly and powerfully than we ever imagined. And that's, in a way, shocking novel news, but it's not news to the contemplatives. They, for millennia, have been telling us, you want to develop virtue, you want to develop wisdom, you want to develop insight, compassion, hang out with people who have it. That is, find your own community, look for the wisest, most mature people you know, and try to figure out how to spend as much time as possible with them. So that's the first thing, community. Friends and teachers, of course. Even better if you can find a teacher. So the second is study, but a particular kind of study. That is study of wisdom texts, the great texts. Dana read from the Tao Te Ching at the beginning. Classic wisdom text, influenced Chinese culture for millennia. So, but the study has to be very different. It's not reading for information, it's reading for transformation. And you find the same themes across traditions, but the one which it's spelled out most extensively is the Christian contemplative tradition, which discusses the practice of lectio divina, divine reading. And it recommends just taking a few sentences, even perhaps a phrase, and really imbibing it. That's the reading, the lectio. Then the meditatio, the second phrase, is reflection. Take that sentence, those sentences, and just reflect on them. Look at the associations, the implications. What's it mean? How does it affect you? Then there's the oratio, which is the heartfelt change. That is, if we read a profound text, you can often feel it just having its emotional impact on you. As an idea really lands, there's an intuitive feel that goes with a new idea or a deeper idea opening and deepening and softening and tenderizing us. So that's the feeling part. And then there's the contemplatio, which is the meditation. That is, here the words drop away and one is left in the state of consciousness that they induce. So those 4 steps, and one finds them across traditions, are powerful ways of study and taking profound texts and imbibing them. So those 2 practices, friends or community and teachers, study. And then the third practice is meditation of some kind or another, working to develop the capacity for honing attention, refining perception, stabilizing the mind, developing calm, concentration, and clarity so as to be able to see deeper into oneself and deeper into the existential issues of life. Meditation, and there are over 6,000 research reports on meditation now. It has so many benefits. I mean, 50 years ago was like, it was something first from the East and then a revival of our own Western meditative traditions. But now there's just a huge body of Western research documenting the extraordinary number of psychological benefits of this. It's one of the few ways we know of developing, for example, empathy, which is one of the most important qualities for psychotherapists. It's one of the few ways we know of accelerating psychological maturation. I love it when contemporary knowledge and science catches up with ancient wisdom, and in this case it has around meditation. So maybe that's enough just to put out, and now I'd love to hear your comments of 3 core practices for cultivating wisdom.
Well, Roger, the thing that occurs to me in hearing you talk is that cultures have, since the beginning, come up in contact with one another, and they've been influenced by one another. But each of the cultures has always had at its core a kind of an empty space, a still point, a silence, something around which the content or the symbols resonated for that particular culture. And the thing that occurs to me is that as we have become more globalized, our ways of talking with one another have become more prolific, but we're losing our ability to find silence in and amongst all the noise. There's a lot of chatter going on. And I saw something in a gourmet food type magazine, and they were actually talking about the corporatization of these fast foods throughout the world. The way in which a particular dominant culture has inserted or hijacked these other cultures has taken those cultures away from their own cultural authenticity. And I think in the same way that we want to listen to our own narrative, our own voice, and find our own path, cultures need to do that as well. And we can't consistently look beyond ourselves to other cultures and romance them in the same way, you know, that we would look and say, okay, I'm going to go to Europe, or I'm going to go to India, or go to Africa. Well, what about just going where you are, you know, and learning this process of deepening our own experience in the place that we happen to find ourselves before we get so busy migrating to these other cultures.
Yeah, mining our own wisdom as well as the world's. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
and to emphasize your point about losing the silence. Yeah, that's another practice in wisdom, spending time in silence.
We have in our community here, there's this wonderful man, Joe Bograt, and I had the deep honor of working with him on a book called Cultivating the Still Point. And he studied different wisdom traditions, contemplative Christianity. It was a beautiful book. And I mean, I feel honored in the same way that you talk about hang out with the people. Well, that's what I'm trying to do with Will, and we're trying to do in the Myth Salon, is cultivate, you know, that kind of way in which we're hanging out together and just in the process of a couple hours, feeling just ever so slightly enriched. And to me, it's a beautiful thing. When you say yes in the same way that Will says yes, to me, this is how we grow. You know, you find in a like-mindedness something of substance in the other person, and it keeps all of the personal and cultural symbols that we all have going on in us, keeps them alive. It stops the literalizing of them. Go for it, Terria.
Okay, well, all right. Well, so Roger, thank you so much. I've really been enraptured with just the considerations. It's like every little phrase you're doing, I want to go down that rabbit hole and stay there for a minute. It's just beautiful. Thank you. Thank you so much. Man, and I find myself sort of asking the question and want to know what your thoughts are, but we're talking about wisdom as something that's sought and cultivated and acquired and maturing and all that. And I'm wondering what you think about the sort of native wisdom of a child or even an animal. But what do you think of that? The child, the little 3 or 4 or 5-year-old. And it comes to mind that Buckminster Fuller, who was somebody was a real mentor to me. And he used to say—
Lucky you.
Yeah, lucky me for sure, right? But he used to say that every child is born a genius and becomes de-geniused in the process of education. And that was his experience, is he just knew as a child he had all this perceptual capability, and that, you know, starting in first grade, it was chipping away at it, dumbing it down, saying, stop thinking, just listen to me. So his idea was that there's that native wisdom that isn't acquired, it's just given, that isn't, you know, it's not to be sought, it's sort of to just be owned. So I wonder what your thoughts are about that kind of wisdom.
Yeah, it's a beautiful complementary perspective, and thank you, Tarja. And of course, life has its own wisdom born of millions of years of evolution. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here. So, yeah, certain, there's just a baseline of, I mean, we can call it many things, knowledge or whatever, but certainly one can look at it as wisdom and honor it and be grateful for it.
Yeah. Out of the mouth of babes, right? Sometimes.
Right.
Yeah.
I wonder if that's even almost another phase of consciousness to consider, you know, that's that like biological, built-in, almost imprinted, or whatever you, however you describe that phase of consciousness that we've almost inherited, that we also have to get beyond that monophasic consciousness that blocks out even our own embedded inherited consciousness.
Yeah. Yeah, and I know a number of you are Jungians, and if there's one thing the Jungian tradition teaches us about the untold reservoirs of wisdom within all of us. And you know, I thank you, Taria, for pointing out that I've been emphasizing the cultivating aspect, but another really important thing is simply the recognition aspect, and the recognizing and touching into and accessing the extraordinary depths of wisdom within the psyche that are far, far beyond anything these little egos think of. So, yeah, so thank you.
Hi, Roger.
Hi.
I'm very grateful for what you said today. It's been, yeah, I'll just stop at that. It's been very grateful. What I want to do here is earlier you mentioned that you wanted to have a richer or a deeper discussion around self. So in order to get to that, I have a question I'd like to ask you. One of the reasons for me that I like the way that you talked about self is that you moved it away from thinking of self as an entity, and talked about it more as a point of view. And to me, that intersects with James Hillman, who talks about the fact that a soul isn't isolated inside a person, rather it's a perspective rather than a substance, a viewpoint of things. So since it's a viewpoint of things, and in Jungians are very much about individuation and the self, but if we think about wisdom in certain African ethnic groups, that actually one can't come to the self unless they go through others. So the notion of the self is entangled with others. So again, I'm asking you this question not as a way for you to defend, but so you can elaborate more on your notion of the self and what it does within these wisdom traditions.
Okay, well, that's that's a deep one. Thank you, Boris. And first off, just to acknowledge the wisdom of what you said about the finding oneself through others. And of course, we have many threads here. First we could just talk about some of the contemporary sociology, the recognition that we create our self-construct, self-images out of the way we are reflected from others, and that our self-image, self-construct is a co-creation. It's not something that just happens. It's a result of deep psychodynamics, but also of widespread social networks of influence and mirroring. So there's that aspect, and then there's that perspective. You also mentioned the importance of perspective, and that's probably worth our while touching into. And then the question of self, what am I? Really one of the most profound questions we can ask. Most people start with the question, if they do anything, because let's acknowledge that first off, the self-concept, or what's loosely known as the ego, and ego is one of the most overused words in the English language, but we can use it for the moment and just say the ego, from my perspective as a contemplative practitioner, the ego is an unexamined presupposition, what we assume ourselves to be until we look closely. And when you look closely, you realize, oh, I've spent a lifetime not knowing who I am. Oh, a minor detail. How about that? Okay. So new ball game. So what then? So the question, who am I, becomes a deeper one of what am I? And what we find below the self-representation, if we're able to develop our introspective capacities deeply enough, as sometimes happens in psychotherapy, but it's hard to go deep enough without contemplative training so you can stabilize the mind and hold attention for prolonged periods. But if you're able to do that, then you find that what one assumed oneself to be is deconstructed. One sees through it and finds below it awareness.
Mm.
And that awareness turns out to be, there's a recognition that everything is arising within this awareness. And this awareness, an old-fashioned word for which is spirit, and traditionally was described as eternal and infinite, but from a contemporary philosophical and psychological understanding, we can understand awareness/spirit as actually transspatial and transtemporal. That is, prior to space, prior to time, but that within which space and time arise. And that's both an esoteric contemplative insight and a philosophical conclusion for the likes of, for example, Kant, who Immanuel Kant made that observation and turned the world around, saying, oh, space and time are just are constructs which we create, within which we structure our experience. So on one hand, this is a very profound insight and recognition that, oh, below the illusion of a separate self sense is pure awareness. And at an even deeper level, the distinction between world and awareness is itself recognized as a mental construction, and that too dissolves. So now there is simply, in one experience, there is awareness and the universe, and either one can interpret that as either I am awareness, the universe, or I am nothing. And as one of the great Advaitic or Hindu sages of the last century, Nisargadatta, said, you know, wisdom sees I am nothing, love sees I am everything. Between these two poles, my life moves. It's like, that's transcendent wisdom. So thank you, Forrest.
Thank you very much. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Roger. It was just a brilliant, story and talk about wisdom. As a clinician, I can't imagine ever, seeing 30 people a week for 25 years, to actually be successful without having a spiritual practice. My spiritual practice holds me and contains me. I was lucky enough to go to Pacifica, but there's so many people that don't go to Pacifica and don't have this option. And I see them, I meet them in my world as I move about in the world. And it is shocking to me that they're incredibly limited in their capacity to think. And I think the world is going in this direction of wisdom, but the wisdom has to come from the therapists and all of that. They're not necessarily being trained unless they go to these alternative schools. What do you think can bridge the gap? Because we have all these people coming in that are focused on the cognitive behavioral approach, which is limited. And there we go. And when I get a call, sometimes I'm asked, well, do I practice cognitive behaviorally? And I'm like, no, I don't do that. I'm a spiritual psychologist. I do something completely different. So, but people are asking for this. So there's a disconnect between in the profession about what wisdom is, what even the role of a psychologist or a psychotherapist is, and the work that we do. And it's expansive. Can you just speak to what are we going to do to bridge this?
Well, first off, bless you for for bringing these worlds together. And before the program or after the program, I want your contact information because I want to be able to refer to you because I'm looking for people like you. And a number of more and more people are looking for therapists like you, and that's important. And I'd like to mention a complementary problem, and that is among spiritual teachers who are effectively doing counseling of one kind or another. Most of them don't have a psychological background, and have, you know, my role as a lama in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, or, you know, and, you know, I effectively do a lot of work with people, and I'd say about 80% of it's more psychological, psychotherapeutic. You know, there's a minority of people who are doing deep, you know, really profound spiritual inner work, but most of the problems that people confront when they get into contemplative practices are really psychological and psychodynamic in origin, and they're dealing with grief and trauma and regrets and so forth, and that's more psychological. They can be certainly spiritual approaches add value and depth to what one can offer, but I'm just in my early days, I thought spiritual practice would do it all, and it clearly doesn't. And psychology doesn't do it all either. So, of course, what would we expect? Well, now I see that. I didn't always. But so that's one aspect. And your deeper question, you know, how do we bring this into the world? I think that's, how do we bring more spiritual contemplative depth in? That's one of the great opportunities and challenges of our time. I think it's happening. There is this explosion of mindfulness-based therapies, and the shadow side of that, as you probably know very well, is it's becoming McDonald's mindfulness, and getting you know, commoditized and sanitized and shallowed and et cetera, and the hope there is that, you know, a lot of people take up meditation these days for, you know, to lower their blood pressure, and they get a hell of a lot more than they expected. So that's one of the beauties of these practices. They're kind of like stealth bombers or something. That you think you're going to lower your blood pressure, you don't realize you're going to change your life. So it doesn't, you know, obviously it doesn't always happen, but clearly with over 15 million people doing yoga and 14 million people doing meditation in this country alone at the moment, you know, something's happening. And question for all of us is how we bring this more into clinical work. And I think in one sense, every question about what should I do turns in, you know, what can be done turns at bottom into question, what can I do? So I think for each of us, it's what can I do to bring this dimension into my work and my life, and into clinical work more generally. But others, I'd love to hear what others think.
You just used the word dimension. This is Aman, and I enjoyed the talk.
Yeah, hi, Aman.
I have, I don't know if I can say I have trouble with, but I'm trying to conceptualize the element of dimensionality in the consciousness, that when we are saying depth, when we are saying a point of view, when we are saying perspective, there is an element of placeness that I'm not sure whether we are stuck with it because the linguistic constructs were woven into these, these wordings much earlier. And although we have better awareness, but we do not have an appropriate vocabulary to go kind of transspatial. Because the way I look at it is like if, let me see if I can speak through a metaphor. If you're looking at a calm lake and there are drops of rain falling into the lake, and each drop that falls in one particular place, it creates its own waves. And these waves keep going, expanding. And then there are certain other ones. The thing is that we always assume that something was there, but there isn't anything there. The waves are constantly moving, and they're probably getting into one another and mixing with one another, so that the consciousness will be more like a rain, like the rain itself. And just because it falls, or because a particular drop of it, we can quantify it. If a drop of it falls within a particular place, does that place kind of owns it? Can it claim it? And that's where the concept of dimensionality and the self comes into it. So when we are presenting these various layers of wisdom and of consciousness, and we are expanding, we are automatically assuming that there is a central point that is me, whether we look at it negatively as ego or just a point of view, that we can't. I don't know. I'm kind of stuck with it. But the feeling I have, and I would like to get your reflection on this, just like on the lake, is that maybe we are stuck with these linguistic terminologies without which we can't do. And once we use them, we are stuck with them. And because of that, the placelessness of consciousness cannot be understood, that it's a sea out there. And just because that wave runs through a part of that ocean where we are at that particular point, we don't own it. We don't cause it. It may affect us. It may add to our, flowing within the waves, but that the waves have their own universality. And I'd like to hear your perspective on that.
Good point. And in short, yes, awareness is not only transspatial and transtemporal, it's also transconceptual. And so words don't apply. And this brings us to an interesting thing. In a number of traditions, I'll draw perhaps from the yogic traditions, there's the distinction between relative wisdom and absolute wisdom. And relative wisdom is insight into the phenomenal world, the world around us, material, energetic, psychological, etc. But and that's incredibly important also, but absolute wisdom is said to be the wisdom that comes from recognizing awareness and its fundamental nature. And awareness is said to be radically transconceptual. That is, it's as exactly as you were saying, it can be pointed to, but only in paradoxical terms. And words do not do justice to it. Can you say it's infinite? Well, no, because it's transspatial. Can you say it's there? No, etc., etc. So yes, you're pointing to something problematic. And so in traditions such as Christian contemplative tradition, how does one point to spiritual to spirit? Well, there's the via positiva. That is, it's sort of like this. It's big. It's vast. It's the via negativa. It's not this. It's not that. And and the other is the injunctive. One says, okay, find out for yourself what it's like. Sit down, do your prayers. At a certain stage, let the prayer go, open to what remains. When all thoughts and images and mental constructs drop away, what do you find? So those are the three usual strategies one finds across traditions for pointing to awareness.
Brilliant. Really incredible. I mean, I can't believe the different approaches to wisdom, the different theories of wisdom, the different inflections of wisdom, the different nuances and dimensions of wisdom that you're able to bring into this conversation so fluently and easily. It's a real pleasure, and thank you. And I think that Dana is over here, has got some audience ready to join us as well. Is that right, Dana?
Michelle Coletti.
Yeah, very cool. Wisdom traditions. Oh my gosh. No, absolutely.
Yeah, no, I'm for them. Yes.
For years I've been doing like a homesteady metaphysical class based on the Tarot, which kind of like is in the Hermetic tradition, Kabbalistic tradition, and I would call it an ancient wisdom tradition. And thinking about the comment about, when we're kids, we have our own innate wisdom, or you could call it body wisdom. And just kind of thinking about, the typical educational process and growing up in the world, you're kind of really removed from your relationship with your innate wisdom. You're removed from your relationship with your body. You're told, don't cry, I'll give you something to cry about, all that kind of stuff. So I guess I'm wondering if the search for wisdom, the cultivation of wisdom is in a sense very similar to like returning back to that state of innate wisdom when you were a child. And I also say that because I think the more I do this study, the more intuitive and the more I feel like I come back to myself.
Beautiful. Well, a couple of themes there. You mentioned the wisdom of the Tarot, and behind me in this bookshelf is the book, Meditations on the Tarot, which Father Thomas Keating, who many people think of as one of the greatest Christian contemplatives, mystics of our time, described as the most profound book in Christian contemplation that he had read in many, many, many years. So there is that potential for wisdom within the Tarot and the reading of it. Then there's a question you raised of, well, okay, we have this innate wisdom, as a couple of people have pointed out, as children, as Daria pointed out. Is wisdom a return to that? And that's a tricky one. It can be a return to the unmediated access to our inner wisdom, but it's not a return to an earlier way of being. That's a kind of
Right.
retro-romantic fallacy.
Right. Yeah.
So both of those things.
Right. It's like getting that back, but in your adult form.
Well said. Yes.
Roger, would you explain pre-trans, since this has come up twice?
Here I'm drawing on Ken Wilber's work and you're right, I hadn't been thinking of it in those terms, Connie, but we have mentioned a couple of times a so-called pre-trans fallacy. And this idea comes from Ken Wilber, or pre-post fallacy, that if we look at development, what we now recognize, there are three broad bands of development. There are many stages, but three broad bands. There's the pre-conventional, we come into the world unenculturated and not yet imbibing the conventions of culture. There's a conventional, where we're enculturated and accept the culture and its conventions, and then there's post-conventional stages. Now, since our Western culture really doesn't recognize adult development, only doesn't as yet really recognize the many post-conventional stages, then what we've tended to do is just assume that there's pre-conventional and conventional, and the post-conventional or even the trans-conventional, the really profound advanced developmental stages, have been sometimes mistaken for earlier stages. And sometimes it seems like the great psychological pioneers fell into that trap. Freud clearly mistook post-conventional, trans-conventional stages, mistook them to be pre-conventional. And Jung, for all his genius, sometimes seemed to me to elevate pre-conventional stages and experiences to trans-conventional ones. So it's a trap that now we know about the adult development we can hopefully avoid.
So in other words, there are these qualities in the state, qualities of unity, like in the womb, qualities that are sort of non-dual, which we associate with really early stages and post-conventional transcendent stages. So,
Yes.
right, so we've confused them. And I think
Yeah.
it's an important distinction to make so that we don't romanticize pre-literate cultures, and we don't romanticize pre-egoic states.
Yeah,
Because they're not the same after the development of the ego, even though they look alike.
Yeah, very important distinction, Connie. We can add to that pathological states. There's an enormous difference between the inability to create a subject-object distinction, that is to create a self-construct, self-image, which is the early childhood experience, and the schizophrenic's disintegration of the cognitive ability to create a self-other distinction, which can also result in unitive states, and the contemplative's non-dual state in which they recognize the arbitrary constructed nature of the distinction. And those are very different, but you're right. And it's a very important point, Connie, so thank you.
Thank you. And, then we can get really trippy and start to wonder about the atemporality of experience and the experience of how important that experience of being a baby may be in an atemporal participation with where we get maybe later as mystics. But maybe I'll cap that off and take us to a more rational question, which is, you talk about a shift from that I think this is really interesting because we're with the coronavirus. One of the things in the background is how are we changing? What change is coming? What is impending? And I think that what you're talking about is one of the very important places to look. This new, what is going to come from these last several decades of starting to integrate more multiphasic consciousness into our way of seeing. And one of the questions I've been playing around with, and I'd be curious to know your thoughts about, is I think that we only entered into that because it was within the monophasic consciousness that we cracked into it. So it was rational science that uncovered the quantum, and it was rational psychologists that uncovered the unconscious. They weren't, you see what I mean? I think it's really interesting that we walked right into it from our hyper-rational consciousness.
Yeah, and let's hear it for that kind of those cognitive capacities. And I hope, and I certainly want to clearly, one of the things wise people do, it seems, is they integrate. It's not an either or. They live more in the both and sphere. Let's see, I'm assuming we have just a little over 20 minutes, and I'm wondering if I might just say a little bit, get a conversation going around the topic of the application of wisdom to our contemporary crises that we're facing. Maybe I'll just say a few words about that and spark a conversation. I want to suggest that when we look out at the world and the many challenges, social and global, we're facing, the enormous threats, a time when a growing number of people are deeply concerned about civilizational collapse in the face of ecological and other crises. The question that comes up is, well, what can I do? And I want to suggest that if we are to apply wisdom to any major problem, but let's look at the big ones, that there are a series of questions. And in order of depth, they go from at first it's like, well, the politicians should do that, and those people should do that. But when we look really deeply, we realize the only place we can have an impact is through our own choices. And so the question becomes, what can I do? And below that, deeper question is, what am I drawn to do? Because if we reflect deeply enough, we really realize that each of us has our own talents and capacities and proclivities. And so each of us is drawn by particular kinds of suffering and inspired by particular forms of action. So it's, what am I drawn to do? And below that is the question, what's the most strategic thing I can do? Okay, I want to do something, I'm looking, but what's most strategic? How can I leverage my impact for most benefit? And then at a deeper level still is the question, how can I orient my life to be a more effective instrument of service? So this is not a one-time thing, it's more a lifetime question. And it's really important to realize what kinds of questions these are, because there are two major kinds of questions. There are knowledge questions and there are wisdom questions. Knowledge questions have a one-time answer. Is it raining outside? Look out the window. No rain. End of question. But wisdom questions are more like koans. Each time you ask them, they have the potential for taking you deeper into the question, deeper into yourself, and deeper into life. And these are wisdom questions. So what can I do? What's the most strategic thing I can do? These are questions hopefully we'll be asking ourselves for the rest of our lives. And the deepest responses clearly will recognize that given that the state of the world reflects the state of our minds now, so great is our technological power, we come to realize that what we call our global problems are actually global symptoms. They're symptoms of our individual and collective psychological and spiritual dysfunctions and immaturities. And so if we're to really address these problems and the root and the source of the problems, we need not only to feed the hungry and reduce nuclear weapons and reduce pollution, etc. We need to also address the psychological, spiritual glitches within ourselves and between ourselves, which have led to these problems in the first place. So we need both outer action and inner action. And the deepest responses will include that. They'll work towards the solution of these problems while also trying to address the psychological issues as well. And that, I think, a community like this has a particular understanding of the depths of the psyche and the roots of some of the problems we're facing, and can appreciate that we need to work in all these ways, both inner and outer. And at a certain point, we begin to we appreciate, well, okay, we need to do both. How can we do both? And without taking the time to go into it in detail, there are practices of which the best exemplar is the yogic Indian yoga practice of karma yoga, which do both, which work on both outer issues and our inner self at the same time. And karma yoga is the yoga in which we use our work and action and service in the world as the focus of our spiritual practice. And it has three core elements and can be spun out into more. And if you want more detail on this, I did a talk on it for the Integral European Conference a couple of years ago, and it's still up there. But basically, the real essential of karma yoga is before beginning any major activity, one offers it to a transpersonal goal. Traditionally, it's God or Brahman. But if you're not theistic, it can be to the welfare and awakening of everyone touched by this action. Then you do your activity as impeccably as you can. And the third thing is simultaneously letting go of attachment to the outcome, how it turns out. And it's that third part, the letting go of attachment, how things turn out, which makes karma yoga such a knife-edge practice, because it pares away egocentricity and wanting things to turn out the way I think they should, and it just pares away attachments, addictions, egocentricity of all kinds. So with karma yoga, this kind of practice where we use our life as the focus for our practice. It's not about going into long retreats, much as I love long retreats, but it's about using life as the focus and environment for our awakening and growth and maturation and healing. And in that way, we go into ourselves to go more effectively out into the world, and we go out into the world in order to go deeper into ourselves. And we keep that cycle of outer action, inner reflection going as long as we're working in these ways. So let me stop there, invite your reflections and additions and on the more applied side of wisdom.
For some reason, listening to you, I really appreciated all that you were saying, Roger. Thank you. And for some reason, this just kept coming into my mind. Something I saw recently in Turkey, they're going through so much, and they have a new kind of protest where thousands of people come out for the protest, and then they all just stand in silence. And I'm so moved by that. That's that sort of action principle with the wisdom, but then the wisdom of nonviolence and silence. They just the police didn't know what to do. I mean, no, and so everybody just standing there in silence, thousands of them. And I thought, wow, what a way to transform, this idea of protest into something that, and I'm feeling like the whole world can take that in, and each of these people will take that silent moment, in the middle of the chaos of their convictions or the stand they want to take. What if you just stand silently there? If we do that in our personal lives as well as collective lives, it's just, I was seeing you kind of bringing all that together and just all that you were explaining there. So
yeah, thank you, Tari. Beautiful. And it reflects back into Dana's point about the still point. And it's a beautiful example of a statement which does not elicit resistance.
Mm-hmm.
My thought is, like, anything that helps one open one's heart serves the whole, serves the community, serves everybody.
Yeah, beautiful.
I don't know if I can throw in the word silence, and mentioned Turkey, and I can throw in the word Rumi. Rumi, in many of his poems, uses the word silence or silent as his signature line, which is a tradition in classical poetry. And the way that is understood is that that there seems to be an inner voice within him, and this inner voice is sometimes ready to kind of explode with ideas. And that in a few places, Rumi is saying that one mouth is just not enough for the thoughts that I have. I wish I had 1,000. And then at other times, it is understood more in the sense that the inner voice is telling him to, probably not in these exact words, but something like, just shut up. You're slaughtering the whole concept, that the human language, the human voice is simply incapable of transferring this thought. So keep it to yourself, keep quiet. And there's one story that's told about him, is that at one point he went to his Husamuddin's home. He was his favorite student who inspired him to write the spiritual couplets in the first place. And he told him, to put some fire in the hearth. And Husamuddin did that and says, well, bring me some paper and pen, and brought him paper and pen. And then he starts writing poetry. Usually in his traditional way, he would be reciting and then someone will be writing. But this time, Rumi himself is sitting and he's writing on this paper. And as soon as he finishes that one page, he tears it off and throws it in the fire. And then the next one, and the next one, and the next one. And so Husamuddin is puzzled. So later he tells him, like, what was all that about? So Rumi says that the thoughts couldn't keep still within me. So they had to come out, but they couldn't come out to ears that would be receptive enough to understand and to connect. So therefore I had to get them out of my chest. I couldn't hold them any further, but because they couldn't be heard or understood or connected with, that's why they belong in the fire. So say it once and burn and gone. So I think in that sense, the silence has its own virtues, partly because of what I said earlier, is that these linguistic constructs kind of force us to mold and to bend and to form our thoughts, because when we speak, we expect that word to be heard.
Yeah.
And so we want it to be understood too. And in an attempt to make sure that the other party understands, we mess it up by forming it, by turning it around and playing with it. So don't know, maybe sometimes silence is the best thing, like right now for me.
Yes, and you remind me of the wonderful statement by Father Thomas Keating, who we were talking about earlier, the great Christian saint, really, who said, "Silence is the language God speaks, and everything else is a bad translation."
And I think too that Tyra brought up something important around silence, because in certain Native American and indigenous cultures, unlike the Western cultures that we tend to value talkativeness, right? They value silence, and they don't see it as a weakness. They see it as a productive way of resistance. And so I think that's important to talk about too. And Roger, I like what you said earlier in terms of flux and flow, because actually I think there is a language that goes beyond that, this kind of binary, right? So in quantum physics, for example, this notion that a light is both a particle and a wave, right? Then you have Heisenberg, who makes this notion about complementarity. And so Heisenberg and Pauli and Jung understood that the basic nature of the universe is not perspective, but perspective is relationality, right? So it seems to me that the way that you've been talking, it moves me because it has this kind of Gnostic, a kind of Gnostic motivation behind it, which reminds me of the Gospel of Thomas, where Jesus said, the sayings of Jesus, right? It's heretical. That if you bring forth that which is within you, that which was within you will save you. If you do not bring forth that which is within you, that which is within you will destroy you. So I like the way that you're talking about spirituality as engaged with life and not hiding or going on, as you say, on a long trip somewhere, or hiding in the mountains, that indeed you have to engage life. So I appreciate that.
Yeah, it could have been Jung that said that, couldn't it? Yeah, it's beautiful. Good theology at its best is good psychology. Yes.
Oh.
Yeah.
I just wanted to add that part about silence and states of consciousness, and about God being silent, and that's one of the stories we tell, is that God went silent at some point, right? And I just wanted to bring out Tolkien's kind of interpretation of that, saying God didn't go silent. We stopped speaking the language, which was a language of silence. And for him, that was a language of mythopoesis. Everything in existence is a statement from the silence about the divine or the transcendental or whatever we want to call it. And here, because we are a Myth Salon, I just wanted to point to that modality, that state of consciousness, the mythopoeic framework that is hoping to sometimes interpret the silent statements of the divine.
Beautiful. Thank you.
Beautiful.
I'm just struck by the way in which the thing that gets me and us individually into trouble is this heightened sense of a separate self. That the separate self is where all of our separation issues come from. That as we would unite ourselves with one another, find ourselves in relation, whether it's a relation with friends, relation with community, relations with a partner, relations with humanity and the cosmos. This is where healing takes place, is in that relational bonding with one another. And it doesn't need a language. It transcends cultures, it's us making ourselves available and allowing ourselves to greet a stranger on the street. One of the things that has struck me as we've been embroiled in this pandemic is how friendly people really are. And I think that we have to find some island that's a sanctuary during this coronavirus in order to come out of it. Because if we don't come out with a community, if we don't come out with a stronger sense of relation, what's it all about? I mean, what are we going to end up with? People are looking to communicate. they want to just participate. They want that like-mindedness. They want to come hear you, Roger. I mean, they really, they want wisdom. They don't know what it is, but they know it when they see it. And you really have brought a real gift into us this afternoon by availing the many aspects that you obviously have spent a career developing. And it's just beautiful, you know, your gifts of sharing, your eloquence, your beauty as a person. And I'm really sorry about your mate, your wife. I mean, I just can't tell you how that just drove into me. You know, I can only say that it's something that anybody who's in a deep relationship, they feel presence and loss, because the loss brings up the presence. And so your willingness to share that really was very meaningful. I'm touched by the afternoon that we've been able to spend together.
Gratitude, Roger. Gratitude, everyone. It was really lovely.
Yeah, thank you, Connie, for introducing us to Roger. And I want to make sure to thank Teria for joining us tonight as a special panelist. Thank you.
Yeah, and I would add my thanks to the opportunity of having this kind of rich and deep discussion, which is just beautiful to have the opportunity to share in this way among ourselves and explore such deep topics. And I'd just also like to suggest that one of the things we do in Tibetan Buddhism, whenever there's been a chance to explore and practice deeply, is to offer the benefits for the welfare and awakening of all. So may all we've experienced and explored and enjoyed and delighted in discovering this afternoon, may it serve the welfare and awakening of all.
With that, let's have a moment of silence for just the sacred nature of existence, and hopefully we don't destroy it in the process of what we're going through now. And, you know, the cosmos will endure without humanity. We have to earn our right to continue. And let's hope that we do all the right stuff. So let's give a moment of silence, please. Thank you all for coming. Roger, thank you very much for being with us today. It was a deeply meaningful this afternoon, and we'll see you all next time and down the road. Journey together. Peace be with you.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Sure.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Roger.